North America clearly has a problem with scouting new talent and also just giving new talent a chance in and of itself. And all of this is kind of compounded by the lack of player base, of course, maybe even player skill to some degree, and also maybe player culture as well too, with all the one tricks and whatever and the streamer culture of North America. Now, it's very clear to see within this 2020 year, at least at the very start of the spring split, to where many teams actually just had no clue what they were doing when they constructed their rosters. And this gets more and more apparent as the years roll by, and especially for the spring split when you see a lot of teams not gelling as well and just overall lineups looking very lackluster, and some of them just going, what the fuck were you thinking when you were trying to create this lineup in the first place, because it doesn't make sense on paper. So obviously I'm alluding to first, the Immortals lineup, which, as everyone has been saying for quite a while, had no firepower when they initially created the roster. And we saw in the spring split that they had no firepower at all. And they carried that into the summer split, which saw them then do a slew of changes in order to get some wins on the board. Counterlogic Gaming did the same thing when they had Pawn in their lineup beforehand, and also Ruin as well in the top lane, who really only had the odd game here and there in order to look good. And then you had the whole personality issue of having a very passive bot lane of Stixxay and Biofrost, two personalities in which everyone, at least within the scene, that knows about their personalities through interviews or content creation, or maybe even anecdotes from other teammates, that this bot lane really wasn't the most optimal bot lane. It's not to say that they're awful because of just their inherent raw skill, but if you're trying to get the most bang for your buck, you don't put two passive players together. Then, of course, going all the way back, you had KT Rolster with their super team, and oftentimes super teams don't work because of the mesh of personalities and just the allocation of resources, and who then is supposed to get the resources if they're all fucking superstar carry players. And then, of course, you had Misfits in 2019, which largely just seemed to be, once again, a symptom of somewhat of a super team, and just personalities clashing and styles somewhat clashing too. So all of these have a really similar theme in that the builder essentially had no clue, the GM had no clue what they were doing when they initially constructed the roster. To contrast this over to traditional sports for a little bit, the NBA, they have assistant GM positions, someone to help them out in terms of constructing a new roster, right? And then they also have directors of scouting along with assistant directors of scouting. So why is this not a thing in esports? Maybe you could say that it's a problem of money, but at the initial outset, you don't even have to pay a scouter that much anyways. You just have to give them a salary to live on, and I'm pretty sure there would be a lot of analysts that'd be willing to do that, or even do a consultation fee. And as far as I know, EG is the only team with a dedicated scout, a head scout. Now, given how Cloud9 are already pretty good at scouting, and then you have 100 Thieves, which has Kelsey Moser, which is pretty famous for going down into the mines in order to find that golden nugget. The rest of the orgs, assumingly, probably use their academy coach as well too as a quasi scouter, but it just kind of shows the minimal amount of effort that teams and organizations are willing to put into their scouting department to build up, to find, to see if they can actually get talent, which is notoriously hard to find within North America. So you think teams would have really badass scouters within North America rather than any other region. You know, famously, Korea has great scouters, but obviously they have fantastic players, or maybe so it seems, and maybe this is actually a symptom of why they have so many great players. It's because their scouters are just really good, and they've been kind of doing this for a really long time within their industry. So going back, to the traditional sports comparison in the NFL, at least from what I know, being from Washington State and Seattle, the Seattle Seahawks are famous for their ability to pick up good talent and talent that is largely undiscovered or maybe tossed away and develop them, either to sell them to other teams or to build them up into an all-star. And it's very rare that Seattle does have this moment of to where they can build up multiple all-stars at once, which did happen, into the late 2000s, to where, they got Russell Wilson, who was like the 70th pick or 75th pick, something like that, where they drafted into the NFL, right? And that was amongst all teams, right? So he was the 75th pick. And then Seattle was criticized for even picking him up. So it just kind of goes to show that they actually knew what they were doing, along with, Richard Sherman and Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch, of course, he suffered an injury with the Washington Redskins, and then was traded over to the Seahawks and completely dominated the entire Western region. So the Seahawks themselves have at least 8 people, as far as I'm aware, that are dedicated to scouting. I mean, they even have scouters for different regions. You have a scouter for the Midwest, for the West, for the East Coast, for the South. So they have multiple different people that decide on which areas in order to scout. So why doesn't North America have this? Why doesn't the LCS at least have 2 dedicated scouters within an organization, at the very least, one to do domestic and one to do international, and focus maybe on the most important leagues like LPL or LCK, or even Europe at this point, of course, would be a pretty big boon, right? So I'm tired of seeing that there's this lack of scouting within North America and just people doing their homework, orgs doing their homework, and essentially, seemingly what they're doing is on the principle of stats alone. That's what they're basing this off of when they look at these different players and maybe who they want to draft onto their team for next year. I mean, famously, Weldon had done this before too. He had decided to develop a system to where he could find the players with the most value dependent upon their stats. And as we know within League of Legends itself, stats are very, very context-based. And in fact, since we're such a young sport anyways, our stats are just shit regardless. So how can you rely on this seemingly analytical or, a qualitative stat that is supposed to give you all the information, but entirely doesn't? And any analyst worth their salt would definitely say that you cannot rely on stats heavily even in order to determine if a player is good or not, because you don't necessarily know in what context maybe they weren't the carry star of the entire team, so their stats look a little bit worse because they had to sacrifice. And I think just in general, there's this large disconnect between coaches, players, and the GM itself, and players primarily having a larger say than they should on what teammates that they should get. Because famously, what happens is that GMs will get their core player, right? The player in which draws everyone else to that team to say, oh, well, okay, you have a Bjergsen on the team already, so then that incentivizes people in order to join that team because they know that's a great player, right? The same thing with Doublelift or a Jensen or maybe a Perks over an EU or a Caps. So All of this, it just shows that GMs are heavily reliant upon their first puzzle piece in order to construct their entire team. And then also, just because that first puzzle piece is so important, then that means that that player has a larger say than what would normally go on with a typical GM scenario in any other fucking sport. So one thing that I have a problem with, actually multiple things that I have a problem with when it comes to GMs building their team, is that seemingly they don't take into consideration the style in which a player exudes. And when I say style, I mean, is this a more farming jungler? Is this a gank heavy jungler? What lane does this jungler typically gank? How does he play selfless, or maybe he tries to hog resources? How does this bot laner play? Was he played around last season? How much does this mid laner roam? And then how much is this top laner able to play weak side? Or maybe he just likes to overextend all the time and get killed fucking constantly, even though he knows that the jungler is coming up top. Shout out 2.3 mil. So that needs to be taken into heavy consideration. I think probably the most consideration when you're constructing an entire team. And if you don't break down the fundamental aspects and how a player plays rather than just their stats, then you aren't getting the entire big picture, which is entirely what you need when you construct a team anyways, because you have to go at least to the big picture and then focus in more and more slowly to refine exactly what kind of picks you want. Then you have mannerisms, right? Which can be somewhat dissected through a content creator's interviews, maybe team anecdotes, etc. Other players, maybe even other coaches and how they felt about when they coached a particular type of player. So just the whole personality thing is somewhat of a large issue when you're trying to construct a team, because you don't want too many big egos on a team or else they're just going to clash. Hence my reference to super teams. Of course, it's a famous problem in every single esport. And so it's no wonder that teams fall into the same trap over and over and over again of this typical type of fault. And it's because they don't look at the bigger picture of personalities trying to mesh together. Another thing is the style of their former team. Did they get the ball a lot, right? Are they a player that can handle the resources? Are they a player that can handle minimal resources? You have to look into this as well too, because that's really how you should construct at least the outer tails of your team in determining how many players you can have that necessarily demand resources and whatnot. And if you think that you can get away with someone who had demanded resources, but then you want them to not do that, well, now you have to look into their mannerisms, as I said before. These two kind of things go hand in hand, as it were, anyways. So, lastly, stats should be the deciding factor after you have nailed out these initial qualifications, and helps you choose maybe between player A or player B, sort of, as a tiebreaker. And it shouldn't just be the initial thing or the primary thing, I guess, that you would go to in order to determine if a player should be on your team or not, right? Stats, I think they're great for narrowing down maybe in a wide span of players, right? You obviously don't want to take any of the players with very, very low stats. The likelihood of them being an actually good player is probably pretty low, even with additional context of, their team being super shit, or maybe them playing weak side or whatnot. Generally, if a player is good, or even decent to really fucking good, then they're not going to have shit stats regardless, right? So yeah, you can use stats in that way, but don't use it as the entire story to then narrow down into like a specific focal point of like 10 or 12 players that you think that you really, really, really need, right? Like don't use stats in that regard. It's supposed to be a large narrowing aspect rather than something that is incredibly focused. Now, of course, money comes into the equation, which fans conveniently like to dismiss every time that they talk about roster swaps or building a particular roster, or maybe a team itself building a particular roster, and why didn't they just get Faker or some shit. Like, obviously money is a really big factor, but now that's not to say that you can just then use your money recklessly if you have a particular budget that is maybe even decent, right? You can't just be like in Immortals, for instance, and buy a big name player like Xmithy, spend all of your money on Xmithy, and then have very little money for each of the other positions. And now you can see that they're struggling and they've had to make multiple roster changes because of this particular problem. And seemingly they did this move as to maybe take away from the playing field rather than try and construct their own idea of how they wanted to actually play the game in terms of the off season. So all in all, teams just need to spend some money at least on their scouting division, right? And as the famous quote has been said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? That's why mechanics always say to keep up with your air filter and your engine oil and all your maintenances, your brakes and your tires, because it will save you a lot of money in the end. Just imagine $40 to replace your engine oil versus thousands of dollars to replace the literal fucking engine that is driving your car. Prevention is very good. That's why they call it automotive preventive maintenance, right? So teams need to look into this aspect and realize that they could actually probably save a lot of money in terms of contract deals if they were to develop in their scouting division and then look for the hidden gems within the North American server or even elsewhere in the international realms, and then find that particular player which is just hasn't quite made it into the pro scene yet you could probably make into a superstar, right? And just pay peanuts in order to get him. So I don't know why teams don't spend this amount of money in order to actually build up their organization and their infrastructure, which is more important because that is more permanent than the players that are actually on your team, right? Because players are always going to be traded and shifted in and out. So why not build up the infrastructure, which can last a lot longer and create that preventative maintenance? So teams are just seemingly skipping steps, and I think until teams within North America fix the scouting problem, then we're just going to see these terrible rosters being built and teams just not learning from their mistakes and organizations spending the big bucks when it's not even necessary.